Hey there, I am Nick Camerata. I'm on the Clarity team at OpenAI, and today I'm going to be looking at the building blocks of interpretability, which is a paper written about a year and a half ago by people at Google Brain, Google Cloud, and CMU. Some of these people have moved from Google Brain over to OpenAI and work at the team I'm on now, and then others still work at Google or at MIT and various places. So this paper is on Distill, machine learning journal, and it talks about how interpretability, so looking at the how neural networks work and what they learn, is typically considered a bunch of disparate research threads like attribution or factorization or feature visualization or salience maps. But really, much more interesting looking at a single thread is to compose them in different ways. So instead of viewing them as just individual tools, view it as a toolbox that you could pull from and build interfaces out of. And that's what this paper takes a look at. Before this paper, I haven't seen many examples of that kind of thing being done. So I'm going to be giving a kind of a rough overview of this paper, just kind of scrolling through and giving some additional context and explaining some of what it's trying to show. But I'm not going to be doing a line-by-line read. It should be about 20, 30 minutes long or so. And if you want, you can go really dig into the entire thing and read all the, a line by line. But I'm not going to be reading every single bit. So let's take a look. So like most Distill papers, this starts with kind of a big, beautiful header. That's interactive and shows kind of a summary of what's going to happen. There's a bunch of images you can choose from, and these images will propagate through the entire paper. But I'm just going to be looking at this famous Distill dog cat photo. And if you want, you can put the other images yourself. So this header basically is trying to show how this image classification model. So this is the model that's being used. It takes the input here, so it takes the image in. And then at the end, there's these logits, or I guess right here, that choose between 1,000 classes. And the question is, between these two things, what happens? How does it eventually come to the classification that's given? And in this header, we're looking at one layer. This layer is mixed 4D, and the question we're asking is which neuron in mixed 4D is most evidence for a certain classification, so has strong attribution to a logit, which is here, towards Labrador Retriever, which is one of the images, or Tiger Cat, which is the other image. And when we run this, we see that the neurons that most heavily support Labrador Retriever, or the single neuron that does this, is this floppy ear neuron. And this is which parts of the image have attribution to that. So the floppy ear is the strongest evidence the neural network has, and same for this one, and then a dog face. For this class being Labrador Retriever, which is actually the class that it is given. This is not an image, so there's no real answer to this, but that's what the network thinks it is. And then if we look at Tiger Cat, which is the class of the breed of this cat, we see that there's the top attribution neurons are this cat animal face thing, this other face, although it honestly fires more for the dog, and then pointy ears. But again, these pointy ears do fire quite heavily for the rest of the image. So I think it's worth talking for a second about what these actually are. So I mean, at one level, they're just the neuron, the actual part of the neural network that is part of the architecture. But what we're seeing is called a feature visualization, and I want to explain what that is and why we actually have such strong evidence that this neuron is looking for a floppy ear. So first, we can actually look at the neuron itself. So if we hover over this, we see that it is mixed 4D unit 426. And if we go to the feature visualization appendix, which is a kind of a hidden gem, most people don't know about this, which is in the feature visualization paper, it's here. If we go to that, we see this layer 4D, and we see unit 426. And here we can see the same neuron. It looks a bit different because it's run in a slightly different way, but it's the same neuron. And then we see all the data set examples, so the parts of the ImageNet that fire most for that neuron. And we see they're mostly, again, dog floppy ears. And interestingly, the thing it least fires for, the negative optimization, are these pointy ears. So it not only learns to be in favor of dog ears, it learns to really dislike these pointy ears, which is really interesting because the cat has pointy ears. That kind of shows why it would have so much attribution just to this one part. And so if you look at actually what this is, what a feature visualization is it's a way to understand what a representation inside of a neural network, if you look back to the neural network, if we want to understand what a single part, so like one neuron in this branch of this one layer, if we understand what it's looking for, we use a technique called feature visualization. And what that does is it tries to find the input to the neural network. So this is an image that's going to be put into the neural network. It tries to find the input image that maximizes the activations of that one spot. And the way we do it is start with random noise. So like random, I can't really write very well. Random noise, and then it sees a value down at this one layer. So it only actually runs the neural network up till there. Then it uses backpropagation, the same technique that's used to train the network in the first place, to say, how could I change this input image to make this neuron fire slightly more? And then it runs again to see the new value, and just keeps looping on this. So it'll run 500, 1,000, sometimes 2,000 times. And by the time this is, as it keeps running, it ends up really strongly firing for this single neuron. And then we can look at the image, and it ends up being whatever the neuron is actually looking for. And so that's exactly what's happening right here. It's starting with a random noise. So you get this neuron. We know that this is the neuron with the most attribution. And then we start with random noise on the image and just optimize and optimize and optimize until it shows what that neuron is looking for. In this case, it's a floppy ear. And so because it's actually causally trying to make this single neuron fire, it's not starting with sort of any ear or anything like that. So it's starting with noise. That's actually really strong evidence that this is indeed what it's seeing. So I think feature visualization is a really good technique to know about, but it's being used in this way to actually explain how it's being classified. So if we go down, this is basically talking about how usually techniques are studied independently in interpretability, but in this paper being combined together. That's what I already said. Okay, so if we go down, this is actually a really important figure to understand. So this is going to be, I'm probably going to reference this figure like 20 times. So if we go back to the neural network, just a brief recap on how a common net works. You put the input image in, and then there's a classification here at the end, the softmax and the logit. And as it goes through each of these layers, it sends a volume. Let's see if I can draw this. I can't even draw it on a good drawing surface, and I do not have a good drawing surface here. Nice, not too bad. So as it goes down and passes from layer to layer, there's a transformation. And this transformation is done to a 3D volume, which is then passed to the next layer and next layer. And this 3D volume is made up of 3 dimensions. 2 are the spatial dimensions, so x and y, that correspond to the x and y areas of the image. And then this z, this depth, are the channels, or units, or neurons. It's a bit different, but these are different channels, and these are spatial positions. And so if you go back to the original building blocks, you can see the same volume. So again, this exists at every layer for any given image. And there's different ways to split it up. One is to look at individual neurons. That is one channel and one spatial position. Another way to do it is to look at all channels, so every single channel the layer has, but just for one spatial position. And the third way is to look at all spatial positions, but only focus on one channel. And so the feature visualizations we're looking at up here, that's one neuron. So it's just one spatial position. It's just one thing, and it's just one unit. So it's a floppy ear unit. So that's a neuron. But there's other ways we can break it apart. And so I think most things in this article are just going to be applying different interfaces on top of these. And so we'll kind of go through them. The first one looks at one spatial position. So again, if it's a cube, one spatial position is going to be a single vector. So one list of numbers. And at mixed 4D, which is a layer, where to be. Mixed 4D is a layer we're looking at a lot. So it's here. There is 512 units. So that is that's visualized here. So each of these have a 512 dimensional vector of just a bunch of numbers. These numbers are not super useful. I don't know what 97.4 means. But what we can do instead is sort the numbers, and then for each of the indices, show the feature visualization of that unit or that neuron, and visualize it down here. So if we hover over this floppy ear, for instance, we can see that the unit that most fires is this floppy ear detector, the same one up there, and the second one's the second floppy ear detector, and then also this kind of ear detector. And these are Oh yeah. So and then it's sorted in proportion to how much it fires. So this is called the semantic dictionary. So it's just in theory there's be 512 of these neurons, but we can't visualize all of them. That'd be too many for a screen. And so instead it sorts it and shows the top few. And so this is a nifty way to kind of go around and quickly see which units fire the most. One interesting unit I think is really cool is if you hover in between these two animals, the neural network actually has a grasp between two animal detector. That is one of the 512 units that it decides to learn, which I think is really interesting, and you wouldn't be able to see that very easily unless you had an interface like this to kind of quickly zoom around. And then Distill is quite helpful. They highlight some interesting ones you should check out. Here's the dog snout, cat heads, furry legs. Legs are really interesting in neural networks, and grass. One interesting thing you'll see is that for the lower, or for areas the neural network doesn't think there's that interesting, such as backgrounds, the absolute units of the activations, this one is 190, are just pretty small. But for parts of the image that have very interesting areas, and because ImageNet is mostly animals, or like half animals or something, that mostly means dogs and cats and various other animals. These neurons are very exciting to the neural network. Like this one is 824. That's 5 times or 6 times. Sorry, 6 times the background. And so this allows you to see both the relative interest, the relative interestingness of the neural network, but also the absolute by just kind of looking at different areas. So I think it's kind of cool. Okay. What is this? Oh, sorry. So yeah. So in the semantic dictionary, we're looking at all of the neurons that fire most highly, just sorted by sort of activation. And this begs for another visualization. So instead of seeing just one neuron at a time, which is what this shows, we can have one feature visualization objective that is trying to optimize all of them at once, proportional to the strength that it fires. So just like that feedback loop that I defined here, where this image and it loops around to this one neuron and it comes back. Instead of firing at one neuron, we're optimizing a set of neurons. Well, specifically all of the neurons, but we're just weighting them by how much they fired in that one spatial position, and then we see this kind of this joint vector. So there's no neuron in the network that learned this exact vector. It's a combination of other neurons. And the way to visualize it is that if you have a vector space, is the 2-dimensional vector space of x and y, but this is 512 dimensional, so it's quite a bit easier but harder to visualize. Is that if these basis vectors, so the main vectors that it learns, these are the neurons. So this is like a floppy ear or a cat ear or whatever. And this is the vector. This is what it saw on the spatial position. That's the list of numbers. And instead of in the semantic dictionary, we're just visualizing each of these separately and then sorting them. And in this one, we're seeing directions in activation space. So we're seeing arbitrary directions or arbitrary combination of neurons, which is much closer to what the network actually saw. And so if this is the actual vector that is being seen by the network, we're trying to visualize the exaggeration of that vector. We're trying to say, push out as much as you possibly can. So we get this kind of, this easy to visualize and understand image. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing here. So that's called the direction activation space. Visualize using feature visualization. But once we have these direction of activation space, instead of just seeing, every spot individually and trying to understand what it saw by kind of just zooming over the entire image, we could just run it for every spot in the image together. Or one at a time, to give us kind of a quick overview of what it is the neural network saw at different places. And here we see that over here it's really focused on the dog face, and then it sees the dog ears, and then there's some legs, and it's surrounded by this background. Here's the cat. Interestingly, there's some cat in the middle, and so this is just like viewing this, but all at once, and it gives you kind of this macro picture of what it is the neural network saw, all the directions in activation space across this one image. And if we go down, instead of doing it for one layer, we can just do it for all the layers, or sorry, for 4 layers specifically. So this one's mixed 4D. This is the one that we are looking at throughout this entire article. And then later on, later in the network, we see mixed 5A. This is one of the last layers, and we see that there's much fewer spatial positions, which is true of most ComNets. and each of the few spatial positions is seeing more by that point. The receptive field is much larger. So this one area is able to see, maybe like, this amount of the image or something. Actually, it's probably the entire image. But the point is the receptive field is much larger here than earlier in the network. So it's able to see more data. And if we go earlier, so this is mix 4a, which is pretty early, or this much earlier one, which is mix 3a. It's one of the first layers. I think it's layer 3 or 4. We can see that it learns all these like fine details. So here, I'm on the left. It's hard to see my mouse, but I'm on the left one. Here we see it learns individual eyes, or it learns like these kind of textures or top of head area. It's a very beautiful image in my opinion, but it's very low level. So like on this one thing we're hovering over, on the left there's just an eye. On the rightmost there's an entire like head basically. So you can kind of get a quick intuition for what the receptive fields are, what it can actually see. And if we go down, instead of just seeing every spatial position with equal weight, we can scale each of the positions by magnitude. So just like before, when I was showing up here that the magnitudes are much higher in certain areas, like this is the floppy ear, and the neural network thinks it's super interesting, and so it has a high 700 point value. This was only 150 or something for that one neuron. Of course, here we're looking at combinations of neurons. We can scale the positions by that, and we see that it indeed, let's go to the layer we're looking at all the time. So, oops, I pressed the wrong button. Here we are. Yeah, so this one layer we're looking at all the time, X4D, we see that most of the magnitude, so that most of the big squares are around the dog's face and the dog ears, and over here it's kind of the same story, and over here it's the same story, although it's more spread out because it's able to see fewer things per square. And it's sort of true here, but it starts to become more even because it's able to see a much larger area. And so what it sees, it thinks it's interesting. It's just a little bit different. But going back to this main layer, you'd expect that these magnitudes are larger because the individual neurons we're looking at have a higher activation. So of course, combination of neurons will have the same story. So this is kind of a just scaling by magnitude is a useful way to say what does this neural network think is interesting about this image. You could just see the size of the squares. So if we go down, this section talks about salience maps. So salience maps, I have pulled up a salience map here, is typically used to ask the question, which pixels, which parts of an image does the neural network find interesting? And again, typically this is applied to the input layer, so over here, to say which pixels are interesting, and here we see this boat, is vaguely seen as interesting by this neural network, and this other thing over here. And while this is kind of a useful technique, the problem with it is that this technique's going from inputs all the way to the end, and there is a lot of stuff happening through all of these layers. Each of them is a nonlinear function. When you combine like 20 nonlinear functions together, you're starting to make some pretty huge approximations of what actually is going on. And so building blocks is the paper we're looking at is all about looking at the hidden layers. So looking at individual one of these, and building blocks is going to take the same approach to salience maps, so to trying to look at which parts of the image are important. But instead of looking at input all the way to the end, it's going to be looking at a hidden layer, and probably our favorite hidden layer, mixed 4D. So let's take a look at it. Okay, so with this, it's multiple layers. So what this is showing is, if we look at the classes, so again, these classes are here. It's the layer before the last one called the logits, and there's 1,000 of them or something, and one of them responds to Labrador Retriever, another one is tiger cat. So what we can do is take any arbitrary spatial position. So again, that's one of these, just these big columns, so just one set of numbers. We can say how much do changes in each of these spatial positions, say at this layer mixed 4D, how much does a variation in this spatial position affect a particular logit, so a particular class, and that's called attribution. So how much attribution does one of these spatial positions have towards classifying this image as a particular class, as a Labrador Retriever or a tiger cat? And what we see is that this area, so the head area, has high attribution towards Labrador Retriever. And if we go over here, there's high attribution towards tiger class. And interestingly, if you look at this square, So the dog snout actually isn't completely red. So it has some attribution to Labrador Retriever and some attribution towards Tiger Cat. And if you look over here, you'll see it's mostly Tiger Cat, but there's some spots that are kind of pointing reddish as well. And then one other really cool thing is as we hover over each of these spots, we can see not only how it influences the logit, which is the eventual class that this image will be given. We can also see how it affects other spatial positions in other hidden layers. So that means how much did the change to the spatial position here change this other layer in 5a. So instead of seeing just input to output, we're actually seeing like how this changes that, how this changes that, how this is changed by, I think they look at 3a, and how it's changed, I think, 4a, I can't quite remember. And so you get so much more data. You're saying from this intermediary hidden layer, how is it influenced by like basically almost like half of the network? So you get much better understanding of what mechanistically is happening as this image is being put through the entire network, rather than making this super broad assumption of looking at just this, and then 20 nonlinear functions, and then finally the logic. And so that's visualized here. So I hover over this, and I can see over here and over here and over here what influences it. So if we hover over this one, we can see that the floppy ear, its favorite thing. We can see that it's influenced mostly on the left by the head area. On the right, it mostly influences this kind of smaller area. Or if you go down to like a very specific spot in for 3a, so a really early layer, like let's go to the eye, you can see which parts of the neural network it influences. And interestingly enough, it actually influences this kind of left part of the neural network, which is probably not what I would have guessed. So this kind of interface is very, very helpful for that kind of thing. And so that's and then you can also see which of these spatial positions have attribution towards singular classes. So it's kind of interesting interface for this kind of thing. Okay, so this is actually showing the same thing as this. So it's showing attribution towards particular classes, but instead of looking at, so back to our favorite image, actually I'm just going to put this in its own tab so we can keep referring back to it without having to scroll back and forth. Okay, so let's go back to our thing. So instead of looking at spatial activations, so this, which is each spot in the image, but it's the entire set of units. This next diagram is looking at still attribution, so still how does it change the class and other hidden layers. But instead of splitting it over spatial positions, it's splitting it over units. So we're seeing one unit and how it responded to the entire image. So here is one unit. Let's go to mixed 4D, the one we keep looking at, and floppy ear. We can see that across the entire image, let's see if we can, I can't highlight. We can see the entire image, it mostly fired the dog ear, this side. This is what the header of the article was also showing. But what the header was not showing is that over here we can see the output classes. So if we hover over this, what it's actually most favoring is Beagle or Blue Tick or English Foxhound or Television or Otterhound. And then other ones like slightly different things. So this face detector is in favor of Labrador Retriever. So maybe that's a big part of the story of why this is eventually classified as Labrador Retriever. The other thing we can do is, just like here we're seeing how one spatial position is influenced by other layers, both earlier and later. We can click one of these. So let's click this dog face and see what it is influenced by in mix 3B, and then what it influences down the stream. So this dog face influences these other dog face neurons, this dog neck and face neuron here, or this kind of translation, or this like direction invariant dog face neuron. And so it's the same interface that was above, but it's just applied to units. And it's a very useful interface for understanding how these different channels of the neural network of different layers are influencing this decision of what the class is eventually given. Okay, so far we've gone through spatial activations. So we've looked at what a neural network is seeing. So that was the semantic grid. Sorry, the semantic dictionary. And then we also looked at all of them at once. That's a spatial grid. And then we looked at attributions of how each of these affects a single class and the logits. And then we looked at attribution also for channel activation. So we're now finished with the entire diagram we were originally given that we saved in this other tab. But there's one other group or way to split this tensor up that they didn't tell us about. They hid it from us, which is arbitrary factorizations. So can we split up this big tensor, this big 3D volume, into just different meaningful chunks? So not quite as simple as these, but just ask the neural network, say, hey, what are the main groups of this 3D shape? So both spatial positions and units, and then we'll look at those, and that's called neuron groups. So here we're doing that. So we're saying, show us all the space, it's saying give us the main groups of what is firing for this layer. So again, we'll look at mixed 4D, our favorite layer, and then we have the different groups. So we're assigning each group a color. So green is this kind of floppy ear detector, except for instead of looking at a single floppy ear, like before we saw two individual units, here we're seeing a combination of units in a direction activation space. This is not a learned unit. This is a combination of units visualized, and this is like all the floppy ear detectors that the neural network has, presumably. And these are top of head detector. This is dog face. This is these kind of dog leg and body detectors. And again, there is no like dog leg and body detector in the neural network, as far as I know. It's just a combination of them, a combination of neurons. Here, there's a background detector, which is like mostly just this grass, and there's kind of this dog. This cat with pointy ears, and we can hover over it and see any spatial position and see how much of each of these components are in that spatial position. And then finally, just like before, we can see how each of these directions activation space a factor of attribution towards particular classes. And you see that this floppy ear detector is pretty strongly in favor of beagle, as we saw before, but also in favor of Labrador Retriever, and it's anti-tiger cat. And this other head one is very strongly in favor of Labrador Retriever, but not strongly almost at all in beagle. So something about this. Actually, I don't know what a beagle looks like. Let's look at this. Oops. So beagles have brown tops of heads, and I guess this has a light top of head. So having a light top of head is very strong evidence for this being a Labrador Retriever rather than a beagle. And so this interface allows us to see this. And I guess the face is actually negative towards Labrador Retriever. So I guess something about, but still, it's kind of negative on everything. But more so on Labrador Retriever than beagle. And it's just kind of a neat way to not have to think too much about whether you want to look at units or spatial positions, because you can just ask the neural network, hey, factor them in some way that's meaningful. The technique used for this, by the way, is called non-negative matrix factorization, which we have found useful in like our team and like virtually everything we've looked. Factorizing basically any tensor within the neural network. I've tried this on weights, I've tried this on activations, in a lot of different neural networks, and I found it to be a really good technique for kind of just breaking a tensor into understandable units. So if you want to look more at this technique, that's what we used, and I think it's a pretty useful one to know about. Okay, so I think we're almost at the end. What we're looking at this diagram is applying NMF, so non-negative matrix factorization, the same technique we're doing here, but instead of doing it on one layer, we're doing it on multiple layers and seeing how they work together. And this is a very similar story to the one we did up here, where we looked at multiple layers of attribution. So how does this one spatial position affect this one? But instead of looking at one spatial position, we're looking at these kind of arbitrary groupings. And so here, one kind of cool thing I forgot to show is you can change the number of groups. So like the two main groups here are dog heads and dog bodies, which is, I think, really, really quite cool. And so you can do the same thing here. So let's select, like, I don't know, 4 groups in each of them. And so here we're asking, what are the main 4 groups in mixed 4A, so a much earlier layer. That's why when you hover over it, you see these kind of eyes. It's much lower level concepts, or much smaller concepts. And this is 4D, the one we keep looking at. And you're saying, how do one of these groups, so again, combination of neurons, and spatial positions, how does it affect groups in other layers? And eventually, how does that affect the classification? And so here we have the top of dog head / floppy ear kind of component. And we can see that it's positive, and so orange is positive and blue is negative. It is positively influenced by this earlier dog head in mixed 4A, and also by this kind of other animal shape, I guess. And then it has positive attribution. Oh, sorry, when you click this, it now changes to blue is positive, which is pretty strange. But let's roll with it. So now it has positive influence by these two components, and then it has this downstream into the logits, into the classification, has positive attribution, so it affects Beagle and Labrador Retriever. But Labrador Retriever more than Beagle, again, because I guess Beagles have brown heads, and Labrador Retrievers do not. At least this one doesn't, which is why I guess it is stronger attribution here. And if we look at this, I will predict just from before. I don't know the answer. This will have stronger attribution towards Beagle than Labrador Retriever, because up here we saw that this one has more positive attribution. So it does, although it's mostly the tiger cat, which is super bizarre to me. And then if you look earlier at mixed 4D, you see that this is influenced by mostly by this class, because it's by this components. So this is the kind of neat interface to understand these arbitrary factorizations. So I guess this is also the least opinionated interface. If you're just unsure what to do, you just have a neural network and you want to understand how the neural network sees it. This is kind of like the most general interface. You can just show all the layers. You don't have to make any opinions over whether you're seeing spatial positions or components. You're asking the neural network to just break it up however it wants to, and you're seeing all layers, or at least whatever layers you want to see. So you're not even making an opinion over like, where are we? Over which one of the layers you want to see. You can just choose arbitrary groupings. And so this is the least opinionated interface you could have, at least out of the ones that are shown here. And then finally we can see, by clicking at one of these, which one of these components have attribution towards a particular class. So I think it's a pretty cool and super unopinionated interface to see what's going on. And so this last step, I think we're pretty much done. This last step I won't go over too much because I mostly already talked about this, but what this talks about is how, just like I said before, that this paper argues that interpretability is actually a toolbox of things that can be composed together. This kind of talks about that explicitly as a sort of grammar. And so there's a bunch of layers, and there's a bunch of ways to split up the activation tensor. There's a bunch of there's activation to attribution, so you could say, what did this thing see, or how did it influence this other part of the network, such as a class or a different unit. And then there's ways to visualize it. So there's feature visualization. That's what I talked about at the very beginning, which is this, which you should definitely read. It's also a very cool paper. Or there's viewing these kind of cubes, which is shown like 5 different times. And so what this paper really did at the very highest level is it just drew lines to these. So I think 4D is this one. The first one is like that to that, and then like that, and then it went through channels. I think it was that one. Then it went to spatial attribution, and then it did channel attribution, I think. And then it showed factorization, activation, and then factorization, attribution. I think then it was all layers. So I don't know the exact web this walk through this chart. But the point is that all this article really did is just draw kind of random. Oops! Oh, too much. This mostly just drew different lines through this grammar, and there's like lots of other ones you could do if you choose to by drawing different lines. I should say that since publishing this paper, we've discovered different atoms you can use, and we've discovered some different things. Like as the easiest thing you can do is, instead of viewing the activation tensor, which is what this shows, which is when an image goes through a network, what it outputs, you can just look at the weight tensor. So this is the same shape. It has nothing to do with the image itself being put in the network. It just says what are the actual weights the neural network learned. and you can do a lot of these same things just using weights. Although not, yeah, you can do a lot of the same things at least. And so this is what this end just talks about, how this should be a way of thinking about the space of interpretability, which I think is really useful. But we already went through a lot of this, so there's no reason to redo it. How much we trust? As I described in the beginning, I think it's really underappreciated just how strong feature visualization is an argument that this thing is actually seeing what we think it's seeing. Like, because it starts with random noise and then optimizes from there. This is really strong evidence that we're seeing, a flower detector in this neuron, because how else would it figure out to draw a flower? I think this is partially influenced by a different technique called Deep Dream, published a few years ago, like a year prior to this or something like that, by some of the same authors, that didn't have this property. So it didn't start with random noise. It actually started with an image. And I think that caused, I think, a lot of people to think that feature visualization is starting with the original image or something like that. But it doesn't. It starts with random noise and optimizes from there. So I think you can really trust feature visualization. You can really trust that whatever it is, this is showing that neuron's actually looking for. Things you can't trust as much, attribution. So when you're, let's say, like, if you remember, like half these interfaces, but this one, for instance. So when you're seeing how one part of a spatial position is influencing different classes or other units, I think you can kind of trust this. So again, like, neural networks are these giant nonlinear functions. So if you're asking how the inputs influenced a logit, which is over here, that's what these salient maps are usually looking at, I think you can't really trust them that much. You're looking at like 20-something functions here. Each of them are nonlinear. You're making these like huge assumptions that there's some linear. Yeah, you're making a lot. It's hard to think about. It's a lot of assumptions you're making. When in building blocks, looks at hidden layers. So instead of asking that, it's asking how did this layer affect logits? How did this layer affect this layer? How did this layer affect that layer? Which is still a pretty strong assumption. And attributions or gradients are noisy and they're not perfect. But it's a much smaller assumption than going from the very front to the very back. So I still wouldn't trust them entirely. But I think if you want to trust the attribution, you're much better off looking at these hidden layers. I mean, if you're doing one layer, after the ReLU here, before the ReLU here, it actually is just a linear function. So then you actually can trust it. If you're looking at several layers, you're doing some sort of approximation. But I personally am pretty skeptical of trusting these 20 functions. But I have some more faith when we're looking at 2 or 3, like with these small jumps in the hidden representations of the neural network, that we're actually seeing the true story of how the neural network's working. So in summary, you can kind of trust attribution, but not entirely. And definitely not if you're looking across the entire neural network, in my opinion. And that's about it. It talks about some other ways you can build on top of this, and since then we have actually in our team, we'll hopefully be publishing some pretty cool stuff soon that just uses some of these techniques, but applied in new ways. But yeah, overall, I think this is a super cool paper. It's been a year and a half or so since it's been released, and it's still very much modern and underread, in my opinion. So hopefully this was useful. And I would suggest if you think this is cool, actually going through and reading, line by line, just go read it. Also, just the writing behind it is beautiful. Like, they're really good writers. It's also just a fun read. Yeah, I enjoyed this paper a lot. All right, thanks so much.